My next guest is Janet Murguia, President and CEO of Unidos US, the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. She joined us last week on the sidelines of the Democratic convention. Now we're on the Republican convention. Janet, welcome. Thank you so much for being back with us. Last week we started our discussion. I don't know if you remember, but we were talking that as the Democrats put their program together, the early reactions were, hey, where are the Hispanics? Why aren't we, the Latinos, more represented? And that got fixed over time, but there was an early concern. So what would your critique of the Republican convention and Latino participation be?
Well, I guess I would just say we didn't see any or much at all, but it felt more like anything else that the convention was occurring in this alternate reality where the coronavirus pandemic is over. Somehow it's not hammering Black and Latino communities the hardest, not destroying the economy for them. You know, I'm not sure where the folks who scripted the convention are living, but it sounds like a lot nicer place than we are today. The fact is that we didn't see the convention had nothing to say or offer to the millions of Americans, including Latinos, who are still living in the real world, where to us, cancel culture means people dying of COVID-19. There was no talk about help for struggling families, no plan for addressing the pandemic or accessing healthcare, barely an acknowledgement that the pandemic still exists, and certainly no solutions to the civil unrest and systemic racism that we're seeing play out today, even hardly mentioning these challenges at all. So I don't think, in fact, that the convention was aimed at the vast majority of Latino voters in this country. We just didn't hear the issues that we care about and that affect so many working families today. It felt a little inside baseball, even when baseball today is inside baseball.
I take your point, and I do remember that there was a Cuban-American gentleman who came in and talked about some of the dimensions of that in Florida and others, so I just wanted to note that there was at least a few. But you had a tweet, Janet, which you said, first, congratulations to our new citizens, but you felt that this felt sort of like a shotgun wedding, right? That you know, while on one hand we brought new folks and we're celebrating new citizenship, you had problems with the framing of that.
Well, it was the height of hypocrisy, to be honest, Steve. I mean, we've seen for 5 years a president administration that has demonized immigrants, that has separated children from their parents at the border in terms of a policy that has been embraced as a deterrent, and putting kids in cages. But beyond that, as it relates to the agency itself, we've seen efforts to jack up the prices and costs of naturalization to make it prohibited on many levels, and really policies that gut or have attempted to gut the citizenship service. So it really is a high contrast and, you know, shameless to promote and present this image of a president who embraces citizenship and immigrants when everything has been the opposite, both in words and in actions.
Do you see an opportunity? You know, I come into these things, I try to sort of start at a zero base and say, okay, I understand what you're saying, there's a legacy of bad behavior, but when you see the president celebrate new citizens and you see a diverse set of people there, do you see an opportunity there and say, okay, maybe this is an opportunity for a reset on some of these issues? And as the Latino community is looking at these issues, and if they were going to say, hey, we're going to open my mind and sort of see, what would be, you know, the 2 or 3 most important things that they could hear from President Trump tonight to turn them around on him? In other words, make them favor him.
Sure. Well, he could start by making sure he's talking about health care and these efforts to undermine the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, whether it's been through the executive orders or in the courts. You know, the Latino community benefited. We've been the most uninsured and underinsured community. We benefited. 4 million new Latinos received access to health care coverage under the ACA. Talk about access to health coverage generally and how you're going to expand it, but in particular, acknowledge the harm, the disproportionate harm that our community has taken under the pandemic, and the fact that we've been in these essential worker roles, but not getting the aid and the stimulus packages that have been forwarded. Mixed status families, the folks who are on the lines, putting their lives there for the sake of this country, ought to be compensated or at least given some basic minimal assistance. That hasn't happened. He could start there, but the list goes on and on. We could talk more about how he's not lifted up or he has rejected the opportunity at every point to embrace our dreamers and to give those young people who came here through no fault of their own protected status permanently. He hasn't done that. I mean, we could see opportunities around the economy where small businesses in our Latino community who have been very entrepreneurial, but have not gotten any assistance at this point. And post the pandemic in particular, we've just seen a fall in our wages and in our jobs. And we've seen no plans or efforts to address that. Again, barely an acknowledgement that the pandemic is still exists.
Well, you mentioned the business side of it, and that is one of the verticals that Donald Trump is clearly leading Vice President Biden on. And as you look into it, as you mentioned, the new businesses that are created in the United States, the leading entrepreneurs, Latinos are leading in this area in the United States with new business creation. And so when you look at the polling, and I've kind of gone in and talked to folks from the Hispanic Chamber and others, there seems to be some satisfaction with a better improving climate on taxes, whatnot. At least that's what I'm hearing from them. So is that also part of the picture? Is it so you've got troubled lots over on certain sides, but on the business economic side, does it carry over that they see greater benefit with Trump than with Biden?
Well, I don't know that we've heard any specifics at all in terms of the future for what President Trump or his administration would do. I know that at one point, we, again, post the pandemic, have seen an incredible jarring hit to Latinos from an economic perspective and no effort to respond. I think President Biden, presidential candidate Biden has offered a robust agenda. I'm not sure that they have delivered that message as effectively as they could. But he has a robust agenda for economic prosperity. My hope is that we would be able to engage both parties in the future around common sense economic reforms, including immigration reform. And that's the hope that we had for a Republican Party that used to really want to engage in that space. But we've seen just the opposite from this administration. Attacks, not just on immigrants, but on the Latino community. And for us, it makes it hard to understand how anyone can present a message tonight, including the president, that could be remotely convincing. He seems to be appealing to moderate white independent voters and trying to soften his edges so he doesn't look as bigoted or as racist as his rhetoric and his actions have been.
Janet, I'm going to ask you a nuanced question, and I hope I don't get it wrong, but we don't have much time, but I want to try. Right now, when you see protests in the nation, you see the fires, you see looting, you also see very well-meaning, protesters engaged, rightfully in concerns about Jacob Blake, George Floyd, and others. But there's a dimension to this that's scaring some Americans in particular. I mean, the polls are showing this. So there's tension out there. Where is the Hispanic community? Do they see these protests as their protests, or do they see this dynamic as something that they want to kind of keep an arm's length from?
We do not want to keep arm's length away from this. This fight is our fight too.
Right.
We've seen unarmed Latino young men dying at the hands of law enforcement, only second to African American and black young black men. So for us, we don't just relate to the Latino community. We identify with them. We don't just empathize with them. This is our issue. We say in Spanish, "Tu lucha es mi lucha." Your fight is my fight, and we see it not just on policing reform, but the systemic inequalities across so many different sectors have to be addressed, and they affect all people of color.
Well, Janet, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Janet Murguia, President and CEO of Unidos US, has joined us for both conventions, given us some very candid commentary. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Great to see you, Steve. Thank you.